Welcome to the All of Life podcast from Redemption Church Tempe, where we have conversations on faith, culture, theology, and beyond to help us live all of life, all for Jesus. Let's jump into today's episode. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the All of Life podcast, where we believe that all of life is all for Jesus. And our goal here on this podcast is to help you live all of your life, all for Jesus. My name is Warren Williams. I'm joined by Josh Butler, and we have a special guest here with us today that we'll introduce in a couple of moments here. But before we do that, I want to kind of place us of like where we are in this podcast. For the last month or so, we've been as a church in a series that we're calling Countercultural Convictions. And what we've been doing in this series is just exploring the ways that we are called to be faithful followers of Jesus in the midst of our culture. And so the sermon that I just preached recently, this past Sunday, was on generosity. Right? I thought I'm really excited for this conversation, because I think of many of the other topics that have been discussed or that have been covered in the Countercultural Conviction series. This topic's a bit different in the sense that it seems like the culture outside of the church, the culture abroad, has a generally positive view of generosity. And so I hope through the sermon and even through this podcast that we can look at the differences in the ways that we are generous and how we are generous, and hopefully live as more generous people in light of all that God has done for us. And so, Josh, I want to ask you, hey, could you do the honor and privilege of introducing our guest who is with us this morning?
Yes, I am so excited. We have with us the one, the only Steve Atkinson. Steve is the executive director of the Bible Project, and he also has been a leader in a movement called Generous Giving that has really inspired and impacted me. Over the years, Steve and I were formerly at the same church together when I lived in Portland. And whenever I would hear him talk about generosity, I felt like it just blew my mind. It gave me a bigger vision of God's heart, the generosity of God's heart, and how that shapes and forms us as a distinctive people. And so, Steve, we are really excited to have you here. Maybe you could just give us a brief intro on, who you are, what you do, your history with generosity and all.
Sure. Well, thank you, guys. Great to be with you. Fun to see you again, Josh, and to meet you, Warren. Just quick bio, grew up in a family of faith, and it was one of those families that if the church doors were open, we were there. And so just had a rich heritage and grateful for that. And though even growing up in the church, I don't know that I had ever really heard the biblical message of generosity until I was sitting in a room at a generous giving conference, the first one I had ever gone to. And it was actually kind of ironic because a friend called me and said, hey, I'm going to go to this conference. It's in Orlando and we'll take my plane. Do you want to go? And I said, yes. And he goes, well, would you like to know what it's about? And I said, no, I just actually have a personal conviction about private air travel. And I say, yes, to the opportunity. And he said, well, it's about generosity and I think it'll be good. And as we were flying back there, I thought, you know what, this will be really good for my friend to hear. And wasn't thinking about how it would impact me. But the speaker from the stage shared out of 1 Timothy 6, 17 to 19, where Paul's talking to Timothy and he says, command those that are wealthy in this present age to be generous and to be willing to share. And he lists off a number of reasons, but it's the last, 11 or 12 words of that verse that just really hit me. And it said, so they will take hold of life that is truly life. That somehow, if you're not living generously, you're living some cheap imitation version of life. And that really turned my world upside down. Just personally, a little of my history, spent about 15 years in the marketplace, in sales and marketing. And then in 2002, joined the Young Life staff and was doing some development work. And that's where I met some folks at Generous Giving, and it really shifted my understanding of money and my relationship to money, but in a bigger way, really that biblical message of generosity. And then had the opportunity to actually work on the Generous Giving staff for a number of years until 2019, when I stepped on to the Bible Project staff and have been a part of that since then. So, but in the Bible Project, it's interesting because generosity is just one of our values and baked into the ethos of who we are as an organization, and is why we do, and I believe continue for the life of the organization, to give everything away for free.
That's awesome. Well, man, we love the Bible Project. We use it a lot at our church. We're big fans of the work you guys are doing there. So grateful for your there. Well, one of the first questions we were kind of hoping to talk about is just this expanded vision of generosity, that when I hear you talk in the past, it kind of expands my vision of what God's heart for generosity is. I think for many of us, when we think of generosity, we tend to immediately default to thinking about just money, like how big of a check am I going to write, that kind of thing. But money is obviously one aspect. But I love when I hear you talk about it, it feels like it's a much bigger, more expansive vision of generosity that's rooted in the heart of God. And so I'm wondering if you could, just explain to us a bit, how do you define generosity? How do you define it, think about it? And can you give us a story or two that might help expand our imagination around what generosity is?
Sure. I think I almost feel like I need to give credit to others because I'm just a sponge, and I hear people say things and I'm like, wow, that's great. And, I will give credit where I know, but after a while you forget where you heard it. And so, but I heard, and this one I can actually give credit to, is I listened to Tim Keller speak once about generosity. And I love a phrase that he had when he said that generosity is about so much more than money, but it's certainly about no less than money. Mm-hmm. That he said it's about all of the currencies of life. And it's this idea that it's everything, because when I step back and I realize that absolutely everything I have received is a gift from God. And so he doesn't look at that and say, hey, I'm just going to take a look at this one little narrow band of your life and say, be generous with that. It's really this idea of everything, all that I am. And I know for me, the challenging thing is, and why I often default to money, it's because I know that's the hardest thing for me to be generous with, because I so quickly can find my security and significance in money that I know there's a different feeling for me when my bank account is full versus when my calendar is empty and there's plenty of time. You know what I mean? That there's a different sense of security or significance that comes in that. But I think it isn't just about that. And we'd be missing out on so much if we just simply looked at it. Oftentimes, when my wife and I will be praying together, a prayer that I will have is, just give us wisdom as we steward our lives, all that you have given us. And there's things that often we just don't even think about, like stewarding our influence, that God has given us amazing influence. No matter really who we are, there's influence that we have. And what does it look like to steward that and not to hold that tightly, or to steward friendships? And I'm so honored when a friend says, hey, I'd like to introduce you to a friend of mine, because I really see it as an act of generosity of saying, hey, I'd like to open this up and share this. This year, the thing that's really been rattling around in my head is I've been starting every morning. Well, I have two things I do. One is I've been reading the 23rd Psalm. And I don't know that I ever really saw that as a passage on generosity. I typically had always heard it read at funerals. And so as I started reading it, all of this language just started to jump out, where I have a shepherd. And because of who my shepherd is, I lack nothing. And then it's this idea of, he makes me lie down in green pastures and he leads me beside still waters. And then the line that just has struck me is, it doesn't say my cup is full. It says my cup overflows. So that means that my shepherd is so good that he's not only given me everything I need, plenty of time, plenty of influence, plenty of financial resources. Not only has he given me everything I need, but he's given me some of what you need. And so I think it's this idea of that switch getting flipped from scarcity to abundance, that the Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. My cup overflows. So then when I have that idea of I have more than I need, it doesn't feel like that often because I'm living in this culture that is saying more, more, more. But God is saying, no, you have everything you need, you lack nothing. So then it shifts me into this posture of saying, okay, well, who needs some of this? And I can begin to look, and it can be any of those things. And I love that idea, that phrase of it's all of the currencies of life. I've led a lot of these journeys of generosity. It's this 22-hour overnight facilitated retreat that generous giving would lead people on. And it's interesting because oftentimes people would say, well, it's a lot more about money. And it's like, yeah, it is. Is money easy for you to give away? Well, no, I like to give away other things. It's like oftentimes we hide behind that idea of, hey, it's not about money. And you're right. It's about so much more, but it's also about that. And especially if you're me, who finds their security and significance. And it's the one thing that Jesus did call out and say, hey, you can't love me and money both. And if you're going to cling to this one, that's what's going to be your treasure and your savior. And so for me, it's been helpful just as we give away to get, as my wife and I give, it's just this letting go and finding my security in the good shepherd who says, man, I got you. I got you.
That's awesome.
You know, Steve, as you talk about that, right? Like I have been in conversations around generosity, and you know, the topic always comes up, or the conversation always comes up. Like, yeah, it's not just about money. Right? Even as you say that, I think about the reason why we have that response a lot of the times, because we don't want to give up our money.
That's mine.
And so I think that actually response reveals for many of us, like how highly we value money. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's like, you know, Tim Keller, feel like I've learned so much from him, and he has such a way of talking about generosity that just, it really flows out of all of Scripture. It's funny because we don't like to talk about it. It's often at church, it's Giving Sunday. We're going to talk about giving. And it's like the congregation winces and the pastor doesn't like to talk about it. But Jesus seemed to talk about it all the time, not because it's important to him, but he knew how important it would be to me. And he knew that thing that I would tend to put my trust in more than him. And it's like, when I can live in that generous posture and, you know, praying the Lord's Prayer, give me this day my daily bread. I don't know what your guys' situations are like, but just based on what I'm seeing, I don't know that we worry about our daily bread.
Yeah.
And it's like, what would it look like to just be in this place to go, man, my cup overflows and I've got some stuff that other people need. And I believe that when we share this message with people, it's really to their benefit.
Yeah.
It's like the beautiful thing about generous giving, fully funded organization, they don't want or need money from anyone. And so you really have this neutral platform to say, Warren, Josh, I'm encouraging you to give. It's like, well, what's your angle? I've got no angle. I want you to give because I believe what Paul said to Timothy, that when we give, we take hold of life that is truly life. And, you know, maybe you just think about this larger picture of it's all the areas of life, and just like, what would it look like to move all those dials forward? And,
yeah, you know, I think of some friends of mine that it's really struck me that we know this, like this generous lifestyle. They, you know, we've had a number of times over the last few years where it'll be Friday night and we'll hear the doorbell ring. And we'll go like, who's that? You know, it's Friday night. We'll go open up the door, and there's nobody there. They're gone. You know, and it feels like when we were kids, and we go like knock on someone's door and then run off, that kind of thing. You know. But then we look down, and they've left like a big box of like donuts and ice cream or like candy or, you know, stuff like that. And my kids are all shocked and surprised, like, whoa, what the heck? You know, they're all excited, and there's like that kind of thing. And I know them enough to know like they're doing that for all sorts of people all the time, but they got their kids in on it. You know, like their kids are going, hey, we're going to go just bless this family tonight, do this thing. And they are one of the like happiest, most joyful families I know.
Oh.
And they've got this practice of and like you said, it's not, I mean, that costs some money. You know, maybe it was $10 or something to go buy some ice cream and drop it on the front door. But it was also part of we want to get our kids on this. We want to actually have a lifestyle doing this. But I've also seen them do the bigger things as well. There was a family that had a child with some difficulties they were facing, different things, and their family car was not working, and they basically this family, the same one that drops the ice cream off on our front door, they gave them their family car. And they're like, dude, we're gonna go down to a smaller whatever and do that so that this family that's in a tough spot, that they can actually have the resources they need with this car. And that story spread, and other families in the church started giving cars to families in need in the church, you know, and I've seen them kind of like spark kind of a culture of generosity. And as you mentioned, Steve, like it's included money, of course, and yet it's also felt like it's been almost a vibrancy, like you said, of like my cup overflows, you know, and how can I share this overflow with others and get our kids in on it, get different people in on it. And so one question I have for you is, you know, we're in a college town, Arizona State University. It's one of the largest universities in the nation. We have a high percentage of our congregation of college students. And often, you know, when you're in college, I don't know, I was eating like ramen noodles and Slurpees and whatever, you know, like my bank account was empty. I had $5 in the bank account, like going out for lunch. I couldn't even, you know, do that. And so do you have any advice for folks, whether they're in college, like the broke college student kind of stereotype, or even folks who are going, I mean, man, all I feel like I got is these 2 loaves and fishes. Like, God, what can I do with that? Could you maybe help speak to what kind of wisdom would you have?
Well, I think what's interesting when I think about giving, it's and this is the way that my brain works, is it's like, why do we give? You know, I mean, if it says that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, he can actually create, which we can't do. He can bring into existence things that don't exist. It's like, why this whole giving thing? Does the kingdom of God need a stimulus package? And it's like, no, that isn't the reason. And it's like, my conviction is that the reason God calls me to give, it is one of the very few areas of my life where I actually need to hear him. It's where I need to come before him and say, Father, what do you want me to do with what you have given me? Because we all have something. We all have something to give. And when we reduce it just to money, then we look at it and go, I got nothing. I mean, I got, 6 packs of ramen. I guess I could give that. But what do we do? So I'm convinced that this whole generosity giving thing, and I agree with you that generous people are some of the most joyful people I've met. In fact, we used to say at Generous Giving, I've never met an unhappy generous person, and I've never met a former giver. And I think part of that is that people that are truly generous enter that posture with the Father to say, what is it you want me to do with what you have given me? And it leads to this deeper intimacy with him that it's pretty rare and unique, because for the most part, we live our lives, we pray, we may ask God, lay some things before him and ask for wisdom. But there's something tangible about sitting down and trying to hear from him. What do you want me to do with what you have given me? And while I don't know, my assumption is these people that gave a car, oftentimes what you'll hear with this, so I don't want to put it on them, but oftentimes what you will hear is, I felt like the Lord was telling me to give you this. And so I did. And so often when people have given things to Nancy and I, we would say, well, it felt like the Lord was leading us to do this. And I think that's the beauty of generosity, because we all have something to give. And if we're talking about all of the currencies of life, whether you're on one end of the economic spectrum or the other, we can all steward what God has given us. And what does that look like? So I'm convinced that this whole generosity thing is about greater intimacy with the Father, is what it really is about. Because it puts me in that place where I acknowledge that everything I have is a gift from him. So now how do I steward that? And it forces me to put myself in a listening posture before him and say, Father, what is it you want me to do? And then it's like what you said happens. It's like Shazam. There's this beautiful thing that happens because generosity begets generosity, and people begin to see that, and it stirs in them. I love this picture somebody gave once that said, like if you sing in perfect pitch and you sing into a piano, the corresponding wire to that pitch will start to vibrate without touching the key. It's called resonating. Wow.
Yeah.
And when people hear stories of generosity, whether you know Jesus or not, when you hear a story of generosity, something tingles inside of you, whether it's the end of It's a Wonderful Life, or you just watch those things on Instagram, you mean the good news stories or the thing, NBC Nightly News used to run this special called Making a Difference. And forever I would see those and I'd reach out and go, Nancy, did you feel it? And she's like, stop it. Yes, I felt it. But I'm convinced that's the human experience because our Creator created us to be generous. That's living into our design. That's trusting that we have this generous host. So when we see it, we know it to be true. And it's interesting too, because the science, it's actually catching up with what Jesus has said in the Bible, where this was, I think, back in 2013 in the Wall Street Journal. They did this section in one of the intersections of the journal where it said, joyful people live a more joyful life. But the scientists did the research and they said, we have this breaking news. Generous people are more joyful than non-generous people. And they did this long study and they said, oh, one interesting little side note is it doesn't matter how much they give, the body produces that same chemical inside that produces this joy. It's like people are wired to give. And then parenthetically, and I think this is a beautiful statement to the church, they said parenthetically, there's nothing you can do to increase the amount of joy you experience, whether it's $5, 5,000, 50,000, 5 million, you all get that same little dose of joy. The only way it could be increased based on their research is when it was done in community. That as a group of people gave, the joy they experienced was doubled. Isn't that a beautiful vision of the church?
That's fascinating.
Yes.
Wow. And beautiful. Yes.
It's like, I love it when the science catches up to what Jesus has been saying.
Wow. Well, and the way you talk about it, I mean, it makes me think that this is related to image bearing, like the image of God. Like if God is generous, then becoming generous ourselves is more accurately reflecting who God is into the world. And it's a way of really becoming more human, like entering into the fullness of the human design that God has for us, is to reflect him into the world as generous people. And Warren, it reminds me, you talked Sunday about like why we give and kind of like giving for the Father's delight versus just to kind of be seen by people, you know, and you even use kind of the Met Gala example. You want to maybe refresh that?
Yeah, because like what I mentioned in our intro is that I feel like in the culture outside of the church, the culture abroad, you know, maybe it's through some of the research that Steve just mentioned, or just like generally in our culture, we believe that giving is a good thing. Giving is seen as a good thing. And so I was thinking about just a couple of days ago or pretty recently, there was the event called the Met Gala. And it's when all the celebrities come out and they have these extravagant dresses. And I was kind of like, I think it popped up on my social media feed. And I was looking at it and I was like, I got to thinking, I was like, I know this is a fundraiser, but I actually don't even know what the funds are going to. And it made me think about, you know, how sometimes generosity is done in our culture, where it seems like generosity is not done for the sake of maybe actually caring for the receiver of the gift, but more so as an opportunity for people to esteem themselves. And so I was even curious, and it feels like there's a tension there, because there is a good thing about, like you said, like when people are generous, there is a multiplying effect. So if you're sharing your good works and kind of living a life that's generous and people see it, maybe that would spur other people on to generosity. But there seems to be a fine line there. And I think about Jesus's command in Matthew 6 about not your left hand not knowing what your right hand is doing. And I was just curious, Steve, like how have you navigated that tension between letting our good works be seen and known, but also not using generosity as an opportunity to exalt ourselves?
I mean, that's a great question, because that's the tension. Because just, you know, a few paragraphs before right hand, left hand is let your good deeds be seen.
Right.
And I think, you know, here's what's interesting is it's so much as the posture of my heart. Let me think if I can think of an example of this. It's like if you and I are over at Josh's house and you're admiring his dining room table, and he's like, man, I'd love to have that table. And I go to Josh and say, hey, could Warren have your table? You get like, oh, absolutely. And I come and say, Warren, you can have it. Are you going to thank me, or are you going to thank Josh?
I'm going to thank Josh.
That's right. Or it's like the UPS guy. Okay. When the UPS guy delivers a package, I never hug him and say thank you, because the UPS guy doesn't think he owns the package. He knows he's simply a delivery person. And so am I looking at the stuff that I'm giving as mine? Or am I simply this middleman? And I'm this agent that is saying, and so I kind of got weirded out once I was flying home from a trip, and I just felt this sense that there was a young woman that used to babysit our kids, that we were supposed to just pay for her books going to school. But I also felt like the Lord said, and tell her that it's me. And I'm like, oh, that's where it gets weird. Because this young lady doesn't know Jesus, and it would be weird. And so I said to my wife, I mean, you don't know who she is, but I said, hey, I feel like we're supposed to pay for Emma's books to go to school. And Emma had been dealt a bad hand and just needed some help in life. And she said, that's awesome. Let's do it. And I said, and we're supposed to tell her God told us to. She goes, that's weird. And I said, I know it is, but I feel like I can't give it without saying that. Sitting down at Pete's Coffee, Emma, we would like to pay for your books at school. They're going to be expensive. She was going to nursing school. And I said, we know, we want to do it. God told us to. And it just stopped. And she looked and she said, why do you think he would want you to pay for my books? And I said, because I think he's crazy about you. And it led to this beautiful conversation. But it's like when I put myself in that place of saying, it's not mine, it's his, then I'm not taking the glory. And it's like, I think when I think of it as mine, then I want the affirmation.
Yes.
But it's not mine. That's why at a lot of opportunities, I love when people share giving stories, because we create a place on the stage at church for prayer warriors or for people that have different gifts to get up and share it. But for people that have been giving the gift of giving, we're like, hey, whoop, not supposed to share that one. But I think when they have this right heart posture, when they go, none of this is ours, it's like you're not hugging the UPS guy. It's all glory goes to God. And I think is it in Corinthians where it's like, it just really diagrams that gospel ecosystem that God gives us his grace. We display that by living these radically generous lives, and then people praise God because of what we do. So we don't insert ourselves as the owner. We're simply the managers stewarding it, spreading this love and creating these pockets of heaven. It's like, it's that, Jesus didn't stay in the temple. He went all over the place and created these little places where heaven met earth everywhere he goes. It's one of the Bible Project videos where it shows it's the heaven and earth video where it shows all those little purple pockets. And I'm constantly thinking, we're supposed to make purple. Everywhere we go, we're supposed to make it purple. These beautiful places where heaven and earth come together, because we are people that believe with Jesus, we have it all. We got it. We got the gold and we get to share it. And it's like, that's just such a cool place. And it's like, I agree. We all have been given different amounts, but I know something to be true about myself is I always compare myself up. You know what I mean? I never compare myself down. And we will tend to look at those that have more than we do and go, I'm not wealthy. But simply, if you live in this country, you're in the wealthiest, 5-6% of the world. Absolutely. And I don't think God looks at maps and says, well, we're going to cut him some slack because he was in America. So, if we're grading on the curve, it's like, no, let's just look at what we have as opposed to what we don't have. And what can we throw in to make pockets of purple everywhere we go?
Man, see, I love that image of us as the UPS driver.
That's good. I don't think I'll ever forget that one.
Yeah, like what do you have that you did not receive? And it really is convicting to ask that question. But man, do I really see the things that I've been given do I see them as mine and stop, or do I see them as entrusted, from God, like that they're His gifts? And you talked about that, Warren, too. So just the idea of how gratitude precedes generosity, how it's actually when you realize how much you've received from God, like that cultivates a different. Can you talk a little bit about that and just maybe refresh that for us? And
I kind of use the illustration of like, there's a reason why hospitals per se are some of the biggest recipients of gifts, right? Because people are grateful for the care that they've received or their families have received, and they give generously to hospitals. And the passage I was looking at there was 2 Corinthians 8, where Paul talks about, or is telling the church in Corinth, hey, remember the grace that's been extended to you by Jesus. And this is a passage where Paul is like encouraging the church to give. And he like how his encouragement to give is not, hey, look at this other church or look at these other people, but like, remember God, remember what's been extended to you by God through Jesus. And that should be the direction of where your desire comes from. It's from how much you've been given versus maybe a place of trying to justify yourself or to make yourself feel like, you're a virtuous person. It comes from the acknowledgement that all we've gotten, all we've received, there's nothing we haven't received, one. And then we've received the most beautiful, indescribable gift in Jesus. And that should be what our desire and motivation is for being generous. And so, Steve, I was curious, like, do you have any thoughts on, maybe some folks feel like, hey, I just don't feel the desire to be generous and they have to like drum it up. What is your thoughts on like gratitude being the starting place for our generous attitude?
I love that. I mean, I think it's absolutely spot on from everything I've experienced and I've witnessed. I heard Randy Alcorn say once, and it haunted me for a long time, that it is possible to give without a deep understanding of grace. We see examples of that all the time. Impossible to have a deep understanding of grace and not give. And not only that, not to be wildly generous, radically, extravagantly. As what's Keller's word, promiscuously generous. I love that. What does it look like to be promiscuously generous? And then Randy went on to say that God's grace is the lightning and our giving is the thunder. Just as thunder follows lightning, so giving follows grace. And I thought to myself, would I describe my giving as a thunderous response to God's grace in my life? And I'm like, oh boy, that is convicting. And it's like maybe more like a soft whimper, but it's like, if it is true that God's grace is lightning and my giving is thunder, then I think I need to come to a deeper understanding of what God's grace is all about. And what is the gift that I have absolutely received? And again, I remember it was Keller's teaching that talked about this idea of needing to identify the treasure in our life. That thing that gives us our identity. What is it our job? Is it our bank account? Is it our spouse? I mean, they could all be really good things, but he says, whatever that is, that's your treasure. That thing that you said, if I lost this, life itself wouldn't be worth living. And he said, there is only one treasure. There's only one treasure that actually died for you. All other treasures, to get them, you will need to die for it. But this one treasure actually said, my life isn't worth living unless I can have them. And Father, I know how important they are to you as well, so I'll give my life for them. And it's like when that penetrates your heart, it changes you. When that idea of that grace and what I've received, it's like I think in pictures all the time, and I think, what leads to generosity? Well, you have to go upstream. And grace is what is upstream from generosity. That if I just try to be generous, it is trying to do this without grace. It's trying to earn something, trying to earn accolades from my friends, or trying to have my Father look at and go, see this, look at what I'm doing, as opposed to it just being a natural response. It just flows out of this love. And it's like, Paul talks about any of these things that we do just start to sound like clanging cymbals or whatever. I'm speaking to two pastors, so I'm way out of my league. But that idea of it's like, it makes sense to me. It's like when you try to create thunder, it sounds cheesy. But when it's a result of the lightning that is happening in our lives, it's like kaboom.
Yes.
It's there's a person that moved in across the street from us years ago. I've lived in the same house for 28 years. And this person that moved in was an executive with Microsoft, kind of in the organization up where the air is thin. And she traveled all over the world speaking on behalf of Microsoft. And she was moving in, bubbly personality. She walks out in the middle of the street and I'm talking to her. And she said, what is it you do? And I'm like, okay, what do I say? I live in Portland, Oregon, kind of the bastion of all things liberal. What do I say that's not going to turn her off from any future conversations? And I said, oh, I'm part of a generosity movement. And she said, what's that? And I said, oh, I get to work out with a bunch of people that are committed to the way things ought to be. And they use their resources to make it that way. And have you ever talked to like a Labrador retriever and they turn their head like, what? You know, she gave it one of those. She goes, I have never heard of such a thing. That's beautiful. And it led to some great conversations and follow up. And I think that there's something about that, because people hear that grace, a group of people committed to the way things ought to be and are willing to use their resources to make it that way, that just flows out of grace. It's not bang, bang, you know, look at me, but it's like, I know the sentence that I should have received. I'm sitting in court. Verdict, not guilty, because I'm taking it. I'm going to take your sentence. I'm free. I'm playing with house money. It's like I can just distribute it and everything. You know, it's like not just my money, but everything I have, because I know the sentence I should have received.
Wow, that's so good. That's so good, Steve. Man, you know, I think of you know, one I think misconception some people have too. Well, I think of a time in Holly and I's life when one of the hardest times we ever went through. Our daughter was in the hospital for 10 days. It was really scary. We didn't know she was going to make it, and man, this is when we were part of the same church back when we lived in the same city back then. And I remember how many people from the community, the church, rallied around us and bringing meals and prayer and helping with our other kids. And I'll go take your car to get the oil change. I'll go take your, yeah. It was just like, how can we give? What can we do? And just the feeling of being wrapped around and supported. And one of the strengths I've seen in our church then and the church community here now is like that wrapping around. But I think of a friend of Warren and I's, someone at the church who they've got a child in the hospital. They're in the hospital right now. And how many people have just been, what can we do? What meals can we bring? What things can we take out of your plate? What can we do with your, like, just people ready and willing to go, how can I give? How can I serve? How can I support? How can I? And I'm curious, maybe you could speak to the role that community plays. Maybe one other window into this that comes to mind is I've worked a lot internationally historically. And I think there's this misperception sometimes that, like, hey, generosity is something that rich people do, right? You know, like it's only for those who got a lot of extra money in the bank. And one of the things that struck me was, both experientially and a lot of research and studies that have been done, is how much in even the extremely poor, like extremely impoverished communities, how much generosity, even as a percentage of what they do have, tends to be at times even higher than in well-to-do, well-income countries. Like just research on, but generosity often in the context of community, of shared resources, going, hey, what's mine is ours, and I want to like use this to bless those around me when they're struggling. We lift one another up. We rejoice with those who rejoice. We weep with those who weep, and we're together in it. And so I'm just curious if you can maybe speak to some of the context of community. How does being a generous community shape how we live together as God's people as well?
Well, I mean, I think it's in Acts 3-4 where they're talking about the early church and how they all shared. And the verses that people often leave out is it's like where it talks about God's grace was so evident that there was no one in need among them. And I think it's that, you know, that's what we see. I think it goes back to that idea that the scientists figured out, hey, we can give individually and we'll experience joy, but when done in community, it's like on steroids. It's just, it just grows. And I think it's like, that's what we were wired for, what God has called us to do as his children when we experience that we come together. And so many of the examples in the Bible, it's like if one can chase 1,000, two can chase 10,000. There's something compounding when his people come together and do that. And it's like that interesting thing about that. I was telling that piano story once because I'm not a musician. So I'm like, does that really work if you sing into a piano? Does the wire actually vibrate? And I've always wondered, and I was doing it at a college, and the music professor came up during the break and he said, yes, that is true. If you sing in perfect pitch and sing into a piano, the corresponding wire will vibrate without touching the hammer or the key.
Wow.
And he goes, and here's another fun fact. Get a group of people singing perfect pitch and multiple wires. And I'm like, that's the church. That's the community, that it creates this beautiful sound that not only addresses the needs to the individual, but becomes like this beacon that more people are drawn to be able to see. So I think when communities come together and rally, that it's a beautiful expression of what it looks like to be in the kingdom and what we were created for. But our society, and you talk about being countercultural, is so pushing us out to be individuals. And, they talk about all the division we experience today. And it's like, yeah, we're all divided. But that's because I think I'm looking inward, as opposed to when I can take my eyes out and focus it outward. It changes us. We did something at the Bible Project. So in March, when everything shut down for the pandemic, we had to shut our office down. People were talking about the economic ice age we were going to be entering. And we have a very young staff. We had about 40, 45 people at the time. And John and Tim, the co-founders, and I were talking, and they said, what are we going to do with our staff? All their friends are losing their jobs. We work for a nonprofit. Should we share with them how we're okay? And we have, we run it like a business. So we had operating expense in the bank and we were going to be fine. I said, the interesting thing about money is I could tell you we have 3 months of reserves or 6 months. And some people would go, no problem. Other people would freak out. What do you mean only 6 months? What are we going to do? And we thought, what do we do to flip the paradigm? And I thought the only thing I know that flips that paradigm of anxiety, and I would say flips the paradigm of individualism and being divided, is this idea of generosity. So we did this thing called the generosity match. And we said, and it's a young staff, and these aren't big dollars, but we said, to anyone you want, we will match your giving at $200. And it doesn't have to be to a nonprofit. It can be to an individual. And as an organization, we'll match that. And so it can be to a business that that's going under, or a barista that lost their job, or a family member that's now unemployed. And it's like I'm looking at the Zoom screen with 40 people and they start wiping their eyes because they're going, wait a sec, I thought we're in this economic free fall. And now you want me to stop thinking about how this is going to impact me and focus on how it's going to impact others. And all of a sudden, community, I think, is born out of that. And you got people that it flipped the paradigm for them, and it got them thinking not of themselves, all that they have. And as a business guy, I'm looking and going, hey, the maximum I would have to put up would be, several $1,000s. But what would you do to be able to take a team of 40 young people and flip their paradigm and go, let's think about what we can give as opposed to what are we going to get? And it was beautiful. Yeah.
That's so beautiful, man. And speaking of which, I just want to give a big thank you to Redemption Tempe right now. All you who are listening from our church, because I feel like, Jim and I and Warren, others, we've talked about this in the past, just going, man, when generosity comes up, it can feel like one of those things of, how do you call people to become generous? And we feel like we're in the opposite spot of like, how do we celebrate that we have such a generous people? Because you guys, man, I feel like as a church body, I'm inspired and humbled and blown away. Yeah. Man, Stephen just sharing an example, and I think again, it struck me in COVID as well, how we anticipated when COVID hit, we were just going to get hammered, and just like, oh man, here it comes. And so we're bracing ourselves for the impact. And Redemption Tempe and Redemption across the board, other Redemption congregations, you guys were so generous that we were able to give $1.5 million to churches hardest hit by COVID around the country that were on the front line. New York City, up on the Navajo Reservation, and other cities and places around the country that were just getting hit. It was because of your generosity at a time that it could have been really easy to turn inward and go, how do I protect what's mine for myself? You guys went above and beyond and going, how do we love and serve and support the broader body of Christ and all. And man, I just want to say thank you for your generosity and being a generous people. And I'm wondering, Warren, I don't know if you have another thought you want to throw in, but
a couple of final thoughts. I was thinking about Josh, your question about communities maybe that are in a lower financial sort of position, and us the statistics bearing out that those communities give more than maybe some wealthier communities. And I was thinking about, my own experience in some of those places and those communities growing up, and church life, et cetera, et cetera. And I think one of the things that helps, and Steve touched on this a bit, is like when you're in communities like that, you recognize how much you are reliant on God to be able to provide your daily bread. And also how reliant you become on your neighbors, right? That there is a sense of like responsibility for us to be doing things that we probably take for granted as people who are not in that position. And so even as I think about generosity, it is something we really have to, like, those of us who aren't in communities like that, like, think, work towards, pray towards, and kind of get outside maybe of ourselves in some ways to pursue it, because we won't naturally get there, and it's harder to naturally get there if if everything that you have, you kind of, we use the example of like, how do you illustrate thirst when you could just go to your fridge and press the button and water comes out, right? And so you have to like kind of pursue generosity, maybe if you aren't in one of those communities. And yeah, I mean, Josh, just piggybacking off what you said, I have been so struck by the generosity of our church. You mentioned some things on the macro level of like being able to give the 1.5 million to the churches who were hardest hit. But I even think about, something simple we did at the beginning of COVID was what we called a help form, right? And it was just an opportunity for people who in our church who were struggling, who may have lost their job, to be connected with people who weren't in that spot, who had some margin. And I just remember being struck by the fact that there were way more people willing to give than those who even needed to receive. And it was, Steve, everything you kind of talked about with Psalm 23 is people who recognized that their cup was overflowing, right? And then so it was like, hey, how can we help? And it was just so encouraging. And beyond the financial aspect of generosity, something that has always like struck me about our church, even from when I first attended, was just the generosity of hospitality, right? The people who are so willing to welcome you in their home and to cook for you and to just make you feel welcomed and a sense of belonging. And that's huge because we're in a state where there's a lot of transients, right? There are a lot of people who have left home, and that generosity of hospitality really goes a long way. And I've always been really, really appreciative of that at our church.
Yeah, totally. Well, yeah, and transients, people moving in from other parts of it. Like everybody in Phoenix area is from somewhere else. So you got all over the place. Totally. Well, man, Steve, we want to respect your time. We know we're running up on time here, but I may wonder if maybe one last thing. You mentioned earlier, like, NBC used to have the Make a Difference moment, and there's like the Some Good News a while back that since we started and all. But the power of when we hear stories of generosity, it's like that resonance on the piano, like the wire inside of us, our humanity, something in us just comes alive and delights. And one of the things I've loved about you over the years is just hearing some of the, just stories of generosity. And so it can be anyone. I'm just curious if maybe you could leave us with a make a difference moment. like maybe one story. It doesn't have to be the best one, it doesn't have to be whatever, just maybe the first one that kind of comes to mind right now that you think of when you just kind of think of something that inspires you. Everyday generosity that you might be able to leave us with.
Wow. I don't know if it's everyday generosity, but it's one that really jumped out to me where it wasn't money related. Because as you first mentioned that was the story that popped into my head. There's a couple in Boise, Idaho, Mike and Rachel. And Mike had wanted to go to one of these 22-hour overnight facilitated retreats, and his wife, Rachel, was not interested in going to one. And he said, I finally got her at the right moment. And she said, yes. And so I'm facilitating this conversation. And one of the first questions we would ask in the first session, they're made up of 5 90-minute sessions. And the first question was why did you say yes and come to this, this gathering? And there's another question that's interesting about, first memory of money from before the age of 12. But that question about why are you here or why did you come? Rachel was the last one to share. And she said, frankly, I don't want to be here. I'm not interested in somebody telling me about another part of my walk with Jesus that I'm not doing right. So I'm going to participate, but don't expect much. And so we went through the session, and you could see, as you might imagine, she got more and more engaged, because the interesting thing about conversations about money is it's the thing we hold closest to our heart. It's typically the last place we will go. Not really it's like we just don't want to share it. Not because we're afraid we're going to brag, and I don't want you guys to think I'm boasting by showing how much I give. I'm more embarrassed by where I spend my money than I am, prideful. But anyway, so we went through the whole course of the thing. At the very end of it, I started to walk up to Rachel and she says, unbelievable. This was amazing. And she kind of started waving me off like, I feel like God is doing so much in my heart right now. I can't talk. So 6 months later, I get a call from them and they said, hey, we'd like to host a group of people that are in our network, our circle, and have them go through a journey of generosity. It's our CPA. He owned a business and it was a business partner and some other financial folks that are involved with them financially. And at the end of the jog, Rachel said, hey, I need to tell you something. She said, this has been wildly impactful and changed my life in a way I never anticipated. I said, oh, I'd love to hear. And I'd heard plenty of stories of where people had given amazing amounts away. And she said she went through a story that's much longer than I have time for here. But she met a couple. The husband had a very rare disease that was causing his liver to fail. She was sitting in church a few days later, and God said to her, and this, I don't know, put this thought in her head, we need to talk more about generosity. And it's like, God, done it. Check the box. We're giving, and we're giving more than we ever had. And he's like, no, that's not what I'm talking about. Are you all in? And she said, I felt like God was calling me to donate my liver.
Oh my God.
It's like, I didn't even know you could do that. But months later, Rachel was in a hospital in Salt Lake City, and she had a little medical background, sold medical supplies, and realized that they now actually have the technology where she actually gave 70% of her liver, because your liver grows back to an individual that would die unless somebody was willing to do it. Because up until then, somebody had to die for a liver transplant to be able to happen. Amazing. And she said, so God brought it home in that idea that all that I am, she said, but it comes in just that listening posture to say, what is it you want me to do with what I've been given? And she's not regretful. I mean, she's ecstatic because fortunately God's created us in a way where your liver grows back.
Right.
And so, but to lay your life down in a way like that. And so I think that's the thing I would encourage people, no matter where they're at on this generosity journey, but just put your toe in the water. Just, not saying, I don't even like getting mixed up in percentages. It's like, just enter one day saying, okay, God, what is it you want me to do with what you've been giving me? And look at the world and say, where is some of this overflow supposed to go? And just try it out. Just experience it. Not for my sake. I don't want anything from you. And I don't hear you guys saying that, we need give. It's like, I want people to do it for their sake. So they can experience that joy, that deep, weighty joy that is truly like what Paul says, that is life, that is truly life. And it's beautiful.
What a story, powerful story. Man, it puts new meaning on the phrase, like giving of yourself, like literally, she gave herself. And man, it makes me think of Christ, where Paul says, Christ, who though rich became poor for our sake, that in him we might become rich. But how did he do it? Even to the level of giving of his body and his blood. Every week we come to, the sacrament of sign of his body broken, his blood shed for us and for our salvation. He gave of himself that we might have life. And so at the end of the day, the thing we want to do is reflect our generous God and live into his reality.
That's right. Well, thanks, guys.
Thanks so much, Steve. Yeah, Warren, you want to bring us out?
I just want to say thank you for joining us today, Steve. You were talking about thunder and lightning and things going boom, and I felt like that was my mind as you were talking. And so, very grateful to have you on today. And guys, our prayer is for our community is that we will continue to be a generous people, just recognizing the generous God that we serve. Thank you guys for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the All of Life podcast. To get more information on Redemption Church Tempe, you can download the Redemption Tempe app, or you can send an email to tempe@redemptionaz.com.